You're reading the news and feel that familiar weight in your chest. Another crisis, another scandal, another sign that everything is falling apart. Your friends tell you you're too negative. Your family suggests you stop consuming so much information, and even you start wondering if you really are one of those people who always sees the glass half empty. But there's something that doesn't fit in that explanation. It's not that you enjoy seeing chaos. It's not that you're happy when things go wrong. It's deeper than that. It's as if you had some kind of internal radar that detects patterns before others. As if you could see the cracks in the facade before the building sways. That feeling of watching a movie you've seen before, where you know the ending, even though the other actors keep pretending this is completely new. When you predict that company will collapse and it actually happens. When you anticipate that social trend will generate a violent reaction and it occurs. When you sense that political leader will massively disappoint their followers and history repeats once more. You're not psychic, you're not pessimistic, you're not a professional killjoy. You simply see something others can't perceive. Modern society has developed a strange allergy to historical perspective. We live in a culture of collective amnesia where each generation believes it's inventing the world from scratch, where each crisis is presented as unique and unpredictable, where each social problem is treated as if nothing similar had ever existed before. This temporal myopia isn't accidental. It's functional for a system that needs you to forget you've seen this play before, that doesn't want you to recognize patterns that could help you anticipate what's coming. The problem isn't that you're pessimistic. The problem is that you live in an era that confuses lucidity with negativity, that equates historical wisdom with cynicism, that prefers optimistic ignorance to uncomfortable knowledge. When you point out that empires always fall, they accuse you of being apocalyptic. When you mention that economic bubbles always burst, they label you catastrophist. When you observe that societies follow cyclical patterns of boom and decline, they tag you as pessimistic. But the reality is that you've developed something psychologist Carl Jung would call a connection to the collective unconscious, a sensitivity to archetypes that repeat throughout human history. Nature operates in cycles. Seasons follow each other. Ecosystems go through phases of growth and decay. Organisms are born, mature, and die to give way to new life. But for some reason, we've decided that human systems are the exception to this universal rule. We've built a mythology of infinite linear progress that denies the cyclical nature of all things. This denial isn't just naive, it's dangerous, because it prevents us from preparing for the inevitable. Your ability to see these cycles isn't pathology. It's a form of ancestral wisdom that has become rare in the modern world. The ancients understood this deeply. Greeks spoke of historical cycles. Hindus conceptualized time as wheels within wheels. Mayans built calendars spanning thousands of years because they understood that time isn't a straight line, but a spiral. All traditional cultures had some way of understanding that history repeats itself, not exactly, but in recognizable patterns. Historian Arnold Toynbee spent decades studying the rise and decline of civilizations, documenting how societies separated by thousands of years and thousands of kilometers followed amazingly similar patterns. Empires arise when they successfully solve an existential challenge, grow by expanding their influence and complexity, reach a peak of power and sophistication, and then enter decline when they become too rigid to adapt to new challenges. This isn't pessimism. It's empirical observation of how history works, but recognizing these patterns requires a temporal perspective that goes beyond individual experience. It requires what French philosopher Fernand Braudel called long duration, the ability to see beyond immediate events and perceive the deep currents that move history. It's like standing on a mountain, observing cloud movement while others only see present moment weather. When you see historical cycles, your relationship with the present changes fundamentally. You're no longer surprised when politicians promise magical solutions that never arrive. because you've seen how each generation of leaders makes the same promises. You're not scandalized when media present each crisis as unprecedented, because you recognize the narratives that repeat. You don't despair when societies seem to go collectively crazy, because you know these episodes of mass hysteria are as regular as tides. This perspective gives you a strange form of mental peace that others confuse with resignation or indifference. It's not that you don't care what happens, it's that you understand you're part of something much larger than any particular event. It's like being a gardener who knows that after winter always comes spring, that after drought come rains, that after death comes new life. The first cycle you learn to recognize is the generational cycle. Each young generation believes it's destined to change the world, develops its own form of rebellion against the previous generation, gradually settles and becomes conservative, and is finally replaced by a new generation that sees them as the problem to solve. Baby boomers were revolutionary hippies who are now seen as the conservative establishment. Generation X was nihilistic and anti-system and is now becoming nostalgic. Millennials thought they were different and are starting to behave like any middle-aged generation. Gen Z believes that finally they will change everything, exactly as every generation before them believed. You're not being cynical when you observe this. You're being realistic about human nature. Each generation needs its own form of rebellion and its own version of the perfect future. It's part of the collective maturation process. The error is believing that this time will be different, that this generation will definitively break the pattern. The second cycle is economic. Economies go through predictable phases of expansion, peak, contraction, and recovery. Bubbles form when people forget lessons from the previous bubble, inflate with the same mixture of greed and denial as always, and explode, leaving the same scenes of incredulity and blame-seeking. Each time experts act surprised, each time they promise it will never happen again, each time a new generation of investors emerges, believing they've discovered the formula for infinite growth. You've seen the dot-com bubble, the housing crisis, cryptocurrency madness, and you know another bubble will come with another name, but the same underlying psychology. You're not pessimistic for anticipating this. You're a student of human nature. You understand that greed and fear are anthropological constants expressed differently in different eras, but following recognizable patterns. The third cycle is political. Democracies tend to oscillate between periods of liberalization and periods of conservative reaction. Societies go through phases of openness and tolerance, followed by phases of closure and scapegoat-seeking. Populist movements arise when elites become too disconnected from masses. Promise simple solutions to complex problems inevitably fail, and are replaced by technocrats who promise competence and rationality until they become so technocratic that new populism emerges. When you see these patterns, daily news becomes less surprising and more predictable. It's not that you know exactly what will happen, but you understand what types of things are more likely than others. You can anticipate that the political pendulum will swing to the other side, that the economic bubble will burst, that the young generation will rebel against the version of the world the previous generation is leaving them. The fourth cycle is technological, and this is where the difference between pessimism and historical perspective is most clearly seen. Each new technology is presented as revolutionary and completely disruptive, but if you observe carefully, they all follow a similar pattern. First, there's an experimentation period where only pioneers adopt the technology. Then comes mass adoption phase, where everyone promises this technology will solve all humanity's problems. After comes disillusionment when costs and unexpected side effects are discovered. Finally, technology finds its appropriate place in the human ecosystem. Neither savior nor destroyer, simply another tool with benefits and limitations. You've seen this cycle with internet, social media, smartphones, artificial intelligence. Each time the narrative is the same. This will change everything, democratize knowledge, connect humanity, solve ancestral problems. And each time results are more complex and ambiguous than promised. You're not a Luddite for being skeptical of these promises. You're simply someone who has paid attention to how these processes develop historically. The fifth cycle is the deepest and encompasses all others, the cycle of civilizations themselves. Civilizations arise when a human group develops a successful form of social organization that allows it to prosper in its environment. This form expands, becomes sophisticated, institutionalized, and gradually becomes rigid. Eventual rigidity leads to inability to adapt to new challenges, which causes crisis, decline, and eventually collapse or radical transformation. This isn't apocalyptic pessimism, it's the observable pattern of all human civilizations. Contemporary Western civilization isn't an exception to this rule. It's showing clear signs of having entered the institutional rigidity phase that precedes decline. Institutions that worked well during the growth phase are now incapable of solving problems they themselves created. Representative democracy is being captured by private interests. Free markets are being dominated by monopolies. Education is becoming irrelevant to real needs. Health systems are collapsing under their own complexity. Recognizing this doesn't make you pessimistic. It makes you an honest observer of present reality. And this honesty, far from being paralyzing, can be liberating. When you understand you're living in an era of civilizational transition, you can stop expecting existing institutions to solve problems and start building alternatives that will be necessary for the next phase. This is the great revelation that changes your relationship with your supposed pessimism. You're not negative about the human condition. You're realistic about the limits of any particular form of social organization. You don't hate progress. You simply understand that real progress occurs through cycles of construction, maturation, decline, and renewal. You're not apocalyptic. You're conscious that local apocalypses are a normal part of the historical process and that after each ending comes a new beginning. The ancients had a concept we've lost. The idea that destruction and creation are aspects of the same process. That death and rebirth are part of a broader natural cycle. Hindu goddess Kali is destroyer but also creator, because her destruction makes new life possible. Greek god Dionysus represents both vital intoxication and dissolution of established forms. The Christian concept of death and resurrection expresses the same truth, that real transformation requires something to die so something new can be born. Your ability to see approaching endings isn't morbidity, it's sensitivity to natural processes of renewal. When you see a political system dying, you're not being pessimistic. You're perceiving that the moment of transformation is approaching. When you anticipate the collapse of an economic bubble, you're not wishing suffering on people. You're recognizing that a period of necessary readjustment is coming. When you feel a cultural era is ending, you're not nostalgic for an idealized past. You're sensing something new is gestating. The wisdom of historical cycles teaches you something fundamental about the nature of time and change. It shows you nothing is permanent, but also that nothing disappears completely. Ideas, institutions, ways of life that seem to die completely actually transform and reappear in new configurations. Values one era discards as obsolete resurface when needed. Traditions that seem definitively superseded return when novelty proves insufficient. This gives you a unique perspective on the present. You can participate in your era without completely identifying with it. Contribute to the current world without believing it's the definitive world. Work for immediate improvements without expecting them to be permanent solutions. It's a form of detached engagement that combines present action with temporal wisdom. Your cyclical perspective also protects you from two forms of despair affecting many contemporary people. The first is apocalyptic despair of those who believe each crisis is the definitive end of the world. The second is utopian despair of those who believe if they don't achieve social perfection immediately, everything has been in vain. You know neither endings are definitive nor beginnings perfect. That history is a long and complex process where each era has its role to fulfill. This understanding allows you to be patient in a way others confuse with passivity. It's not that you don't act, it's that you act with deeper understanding of what types of actions are appropriate for each moment of the cycle. In times of construction, you build. In times of preservation, you preserve. In times of destruction, you help the old die with dignity and prepare ground for the new. You don't fight against natural processes of change, you work with them. The path to integrating this cyclical wisdom into daily life begins with accepting your own perceptive nature. Stop apologizing for seeing what others don't want to see. Your ability to recognize historical patterns is a gift, not a burden. It's a form of intelligence humanity needs, especially in transitional times like the present. Learn to communicate your perceptions so others can hear them. People resist uncomfortable truths, not because they're stupid, but because uncertainty generates anxiety. Your job isn't to convince everyone of your perspective, but to share your wisdom in ways that can be useful for those ready to listen. Some need the illusion of stability to function in the present, and that's fine. Others are hungry for historical perspective and will benefit enormously from your vision. Cultivate relationships with people who also see historical cycles. You're not alone in your perception, though it sometimes feels that way. There are others who have developed the same temporal sensitivity, who have also learned to read the signs of the times. Find these people, share your observations, learn from theirs. Together, you can develop a richer and more nuanced understanding of historical processes. Use your cyclical perspective to make better personal decisions. If you know economic bubbles always burst, you can protect your finances when everyone else is euphoric. If you understand political movements follow predictable patterns, you can avoid being swept up by collective hysteria. If you recognize natural phases of relationships and projects, you can navigate difficulties with more wisdom and patience. But the deepest application of your cyclical wisdom is existential. It allows you to live with a unique combination of present commitment and temporal detachment. You can care deeply about people and causes of your era without needing them to be eternal. You can work for justice and beauty without expecting your achievements to be permanent. You can love intensely knowing everything you love will change and eventually disappear in the form you know. This is the beautiful paradox of seeing historical cycles. It makes you less attached to particular forms life takes, but more attached to life itself as an infinite creative process. It helps you see your role isn't to stop time or create something eternal, but to consciously participate in the great transformation process that is human history. Your sensitivity to historical cycles is actually a form of love. Love for truth about the human condition. Love for the real complexity of existence. Love for natural processes of change and renewal. You're not pessimistic, you're a loving realist. You don't see the end of the world, you see constant transformation of the world. You don't anticipate catastrophes, you recognize natural processes of change. Humanity needs people like you, especially in times of historical transition like the present. It needs witnesses who can see beyond immediate drama. Wise ones who can remember this too shall pass. Guides who can help others navigate changes with more grace and less anxiety. Your historical perspective is a service to the human community, a form of ancestral wisdom that has become rare but no less valuable. Trust your perception. The cycles you see are real, the patterns you recognize are valid, the wisdom you've developed is genuine. You're not pessimistic, you're visionary. You don't predict catastrophes, you anticipate transformations. You're not negative about humanity, you're honest about how history really works. And in a world that has forgotten how to read the signs of the times, That honesty is exactly what's needed to navigate consciously and wisely toward the future already gestating in the present. If this message has resonated with you, if you've recognized yourself in this description of one who sees historical cycles, share it with others who may also be feeling that their temporal perspective makes them feel out of place in a world obsessed with the immediate present. And tell us in the comments, what cycles do you see developing in your era? What patterns do you recognize that others seem not to perceive? Your perspective is valuable, and others can benefit from the wisdom you've developed, observing how the wheel of history moves.